Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
As the... what do you say now? I mean, the denials continue. The likes of Boris Johnson still trying to flog mirages and unicorns rather than admit the truth. Theresa May appears to have cobbled together a deal that admits reality. And then, of course, there's everybody else who acknowledges that the terms of membership of the European Union negotiated by John Major and Margaret Thatcher, culminating in Maastricht, and, of course, added to and embellished since then. But fundamentally, going back to that point, there is no better arrangement. There's certainly no better relationship we can have with them, and the idea that we can somehow leave them behind and strike out into a brave new world has been revealed to be almost completely bonkers. And yet, we're still here. And it feels to me as if the needle's barely budged an inch. We're still sitting here, trying to throw up feelings against facts. So how do you want to do it today? It's up to you, as usual, but I will sort of interfere with a few steers and guidelines. I think I've solved one problem with the help of a blogger called Tom Pride, who's assembled an astonishingly exhaustive list of headlines that have appeared in British newspapers over the last 20 years. Because the thing I've been trying to unpick recently, we're going to do micro and macro today, OK? So micro is what's happening, why is it happening, what's likely to happen next, and, of course, how do we all feel about that? What do we all understand about those issues? And then the second question is, the second element of the programme will be the macro, which is the overall reasons for the country having ended up in this position. Can we all agree we're unhappy now? Can we at least agree that? No one is going to go, this is exactly what I wanted when I voted in that referendum. Whether you voted Leave or Remain, absolutely nobody is getting what they thought they were going to get. I think there's probably going to be a little bit more frustration on the Leave side, oddly, because unless you've acknowledged reality and recognised that most of the promises made by those charlatans and snake oil salesmen were, if not wholly untrue, then utterly incompatible with each other. Do you see? I mean, that was the beauty and the diabolical horror of the entire campaign, was that various different figures were making promises that couldn't be simultaneously true. You know, I could promise you X as a prominent leaver, and he could promise you Y. Now, perhaps one or the other, X or Y, were deliverable, but X and Y, absolutely no chance whatsoever. And I know that I sometimes reach for slightly more robust language than is necessary, but you have to understand that I have feelings too. And my feelings are essentially predicated upon the damage that is going to be done to people less fortunate than myself, and some of the restrictions that could be placed upon my children's and your children's freedom to study or work in our closest neighbouring countries. So I'll try to be a little bit more, perhaps, accommodating than I have been in the past, unless you're full-on gammon, in which case I'm just going to carry on pointing and laughing, because presumably your little heads have exploded today, haven't they? And the thing that's really, really, really hacking you off is that all those Ramonas who've been telling you that this was going to happen for 2.5 years have been proved categorically and incontrovertibly correct. It couldn't really have gone any other way. Arguably, it could have gone a slightly different way if they'd postponed Article 50, but I have to remind you that the man who was editing the Daily Mail at the time would have personally kebabbed Theresa May if Article 50 hadn't been triggered at the same time. And Theresa May conducted the first few months of her premiership with only really one voter in the country that mattered, and that was Paul Dacre, the editor of the Mail. The political editor of that newspaper who works under Dacre is now at number 10 in a key job, as of course is the man that outed Shamir Sani in such a disgusting and vile fashion. So, you know, she is surrounded by some deeply unpleasant people. And yet, I think she deserves a very muted round of applause today for presiding over something. Something has happened. If I was going to go all in, I think the biggest mistake, and look, let's acknowledge, if there'd been a slight postponement of Article 50, if there'd been a plan, if perhaps she'd appointed hard-working but not necessarily very charismatic people to the top jobs. So if you'd put some technocrats in at the Foreign Office instead of the blonde buffoon, if you'd put somebody who's capable of working for more than an hour in a single sitting at the Department for Leaving the European Union instead of David Davis, who continues to display astonishing levels of ignorance, then maybe something better could have occurred. It's hard to see how, because you know what there's two things for me that it all boils down to. And bearing in mind that I will be subjected to a small electric shock if I utter these words in a slightly different order. So told you, I've gone a bit Yoda. I have done some pretty good work on this. I'm very proud, in fact, of being one of the few places in the British media where you've been getting the truth and getting the facts, because whether you despise me with every fibre of your being or whether you've got photographs of me on your bedroom wall, if you've been listening to this programme for the last 2.5 years, nothing that's happening now will be surprising you. That is, you know, a real credit to my team and to the work that we've done and to the quality of my callers. That's what journalism is supposed to be, giving people the information they need to make informed decisions. I know what you're thinking. Couldn't you have done it before the referendum, James? But nobody's perfect. So you are among the best informed people in Britain, and that is why you will be less surprised by what has occurred overnight. It's also worth pointing out that when this document is published, all 500 pages of it, it will be almost impossible to read. I thought that little comment in the news from a contributor to Nick's show was very astute, actually, because already we're going to be reaching for the lazy slogans that allow people who don't really understand the issues to pretend that they do. And that, I think, the slogan of the day, of the week, possibly the year, arguably the next flipping decade, will be vassal state. That's going to be the thing that people who don't really know what they're talking about say, in the hope of not having to actually explain themselves. So if you're going to use the phrase vassal state, you need to have a pretty deep understanding of precisely what regulatory frameworks and organisations are in place to oversee and to a degree impose the regulations and the issues on which we need to align with the European Union. And you also need to explain why they're bad. So we'll be back to what law, I imagine, by 11:30 today. What law do you consider as evidence that we suffer from vassalage? The other point I have to make at this point is that they are now arguing that we are about to lose all that control that they said we had to leave the European Union because we never had. Just think about that for a minute. It's a slightly oversimplified nutshell, but that's what they're doing already today. The usual suspects are standing up, say, this is disgusting, we're going to lose control, we're going to surrender sovereignty. So, but you told us we had to leave the European Union because we didn't have any control or sovereignty. I mean, either you were lying then, or you're lying now. I hate to break it to you, if you are a Brexiter, they were lying then, they're not lying now. We are poised to actually exercise less control over the rules and regulations under which we trade, and some other areas of our life as well, including the European Court of Justice, if the early speculation and revelation about this document is accurate. I have no reason to doubt it, but we need to be clear that it isn't formal yet. So that is pretty much, I think, where we are. They are now claiming that we're going to lose sovereignty they swore blind we didn't have. Except we did have it, and we are about to lose it, because we will be obliged to follow rules and regulations without having any say in how they are made, for an indefinite period of time, until someone comes up with a way of having a line down a country which have two completely different regulatory frameworks on either side of them, but also have the same regulatory framework on either side of them, because if they don't have the same regulatory framework on either side of that border, then the Good Friday Agreement will be broken, and that is a treaty that we are bound by law to respect and continue to obey. What an almighty, blinking mess, honestly. And still they bleat, and still they bloviate, and still they lie, and lie, and lie again. And why? I don't know anymore. And I can see that some of them have got a few quid to make, but for most of them it's ego, isn't it, now? It's just vanity. It's just an inability to admit that they have spent 30 years of their lives believing utter nonsense. And that's the other bit of the programme that I'm going to do with you today. Because for me, the macro question is this: why did we as a country become groomed to believe that the European Union was somehow something we should see in opposition to ourselves? So the European Union versus the United Kingdom. There's the extremist rhetoric of the Fourth Reich and the German superstate and the EU SSR, but there's no way that there are enough nutjobs out there who believe that to have delivered that referendum result. It's simply not mathematically possible. But much milder people, much milder people, who would balk and wince at any mention of a Fourth Reich or nonsense, xenophobic nonsense like that, much, much milder people, I think, have been gaslit. That's the word, isn't it? Into believing that the European Union is something that somehow we weren't part of, but were in opposition to. And I have in front of me 2 pages of A4 containing newspaper headlines from the last 20 years, which I'm very tempted to read in full, actually. I've been advised not to by colleagues. But for me, this is the key to unlocking the whole riddle of how we've allowed our country to be reduced to an international laughingstock, how we've allowed racists and liars, demagogues and hate preachers to reduce our fine and magnificent country to metaphorical rubble, where everyone's shouting at each other. And still, Boris Johnson is selling timeshares in a unicorn farm, and still, some people are going to be queuing up to buy them. So, for me, he's the one, actually, who turned the European Union into something we have become conditioned to see as a negative. And I think today I've got the proof of how that happened. And I will, I don't think I'll enjoy sharing it with you, but once again, I will give you what you need to understand and to answer questions that at first glance seem almost unbelievably complicated. But do you know what I'd like to start with? Phone lines are open. You don't, I mean, ring in today. It's one of those days where we just talk about the state of the world together, obviously with particular reference to Brexit. I don't want to hear about Kidderminster Harriers today, not until the 3rd hour. I would, you know what I'd really like to do first? I don't know if this will work. If it doesn't, then don't worry. I'll rejig and revise and put another penny in the slot. But I think I'd like to start with someone who's happy. And I'm not putting words in anybody's mouth, but I can't currently conceive of how anyone could be happy unless you've spent the last 6 months genuinely fearful of no deal. Because for me, those are the 2 things that best explain the short-term mess rather than the long-term mess. Freedom of movement, once that became the key issue in the referendum, our chances of doing any deal at all with the European Union that could in any way be portrayed as better than what we currently have disappeared. There's no earthly way. Freedom of movement, one of the 4 pillars of the European Union, right? Can't believe we still need to explain this. Freedom of movement is intrinsic. We thought, on whatever side of the referendum you were on, there was a belief that we would somehow be able to wriggle out of it. We didn't understand how robust it already was, because nobody ever told us. But we thought somehow we'll be able to keep all of that, and 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 that, but we'll be able to opt out of that. I can understand why people believed it, but it was clear pretty quickly that that was off the table. So at that moment, any talk of EFTA or EEA or Norway style or Switzerland style, that disappeared immediately. I still think that if freedom of movement hadn't been a red line, I still look at some of these people and think they can't be that thick. So you have to give some credit to someone like Michael Gove. But the problem is they rode the tiger of immigration scaremongering. So if freedom of movement hadn't been a red line, it's possible we could have come up with something considerably better than what Theresa May has come up with now. But of course, you wouldn't have won the referendum without making freedom of movement a toxic issue. And, of course, portraying it always as something that other people enjoyed rather than something that we enjoy. And that brings us back to this successful gaslighting of the entire country to believe that this organisation, this flawed and imperfect, but arguably best available currently bureaucracy, was somehow our enemy. Once you understand how easily that was achieved and how much responsibility must be borne by the likes of Boris Johnson, everything else falls into place. But I mean it. Give me a call if you're happy. I'm going to call myself James O. Brexit for one day only. And lots of things to get through today. I'm also going to make a list of who Brexiters will be blaming for their disappointment today other than themselves. OK, so I'm going to start that with me. I'm top of that list. Who else would you like to put on it? No one happy on the line yet, I'm told, but I will keep a couple of phone lines free in pursuit of someone who, if not happy, then at least would describe themselves as relieved at what's happening. 22 minutes after 10. Chris is in Ware. Chris, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hi, James. First of all, as a Brexiteer, congratulations.
Why did you say that?
for getting it right.
Oh, I see. Well, thank you.
And getting it right for the last 2 years, because I've been listening to you.
Well, it's not. It's no. I wish, as you know, if you've been listening for the last 2 years, I have never said any truer words in my life than "I hope I'm wrong" about all of this.
No, I understand. I understand the sentiment of what you've been saying, but I mean, from my perspective, I voted Brexit basically because I know it sounds a strange thing. I've got 2 grown-up children, and I wanted something to bring the house prices down, because the guys just can't afford anywhere to live, and try and bring the rents down. And on one of my listening to all the debates, I was quite close in voting Remain, to be honest with you. But
sure.
I thought, well, if there's if there is some sort of hold on the economy, and the house prices stop and drop, then it would give. Some of the European workers went home, then perhaps rents would drop and prices would drop, and my children, my grown-up children, would have a chance to get either on a property ladder or afford rent.
Seems fair.
Was one of my... Yeah. Along with, listen, I'm over 50. I'm one of the generation that's been brought up to hate Europeans, really. But, my parents we grew up during the Second World War, and we were brought up with that mantra of being very suspicious of Europe. So
yes,
I'm sure there's a lot of people my age that voted that way. So, but I think the point I want to make today is that although I understand where we are and what's going to happen, I've never thought that Brexit would actually ever happen. I always thought there'd be a fudge. I want to seriously question the politicians that we've got running this country.
Go on.
I mean, people like me were sold, a message for certain politicians. Although I've been anti the EU because of some of the silly laws that we've had over the last 40 years that I've seen in my working life. The way this has been handled, both by Brexiteer MPs and by Remain MPs, I think the quality of MPs we have in this country is nothing short of a disgrace.
I'm not going to argue with that, although I think my profession bears a lot of the responsibility for that, because the amplification and the platforms.
To the crowd,
exactly. I'm not properly challenging people who don't tell the truth, just allowing these phrases to enter the national vocabulary.
Some of the quality of some of the information that we've been given on both sides, and I'm not a stupid person, I'm very political. I voted Labour at one time in my life. I voted only once Conservative, but that was only because of Brexit. But someone who's read a lot of politics over the years, so I'm not a stupid person as it comes out. I don't sit there and take a line off Boris Johnson or off Andrea Leadsom but when I look at the quality of what the Brexiteer message that's gone out, and then you actually look at the reality of it now, which you, to be fair, have highlighted for 2 years, and a lot of us on the Brexit side have said, no, that won't happen, that won't happen, and now it has happened. I want to say, we're going to be ceding a lot more power to Europe now if this goes through. I would strongly want to suggest here that we should be reducing drastically the amount of MPs that we've got in this country.
Domestic MPs? So you want to stay in the European Union and start taking the European Parliament more seriously? No. We're going to stay in the European Parliament. What I'm saying is, we're going to be ruled by Europe a lot of the ways, and it will look like we're ceding a lot more power to them. Why do we need 650 MPs? The quality of them is questionable. They're not going to be passing that many laws now that's actually going to run this country. Listen, what we're doing here.
Why do we need that many MPs?
No, it's a valid question. I suppose in a way, the whole thing was supposed to make British Parliament more powerful and sovereign, and you've ended up at the end of this miserable 2.5-year period phoning me up to argue that we should have a less powerful, less sovereign Parliament in Westminster.
Well, simply because where we've got to.
I get it.
If we were leaving Europe, on an ODA or whatever, yes, there's an argument to say we may need the MPs that we've got, but we're quite clearly not going to be leaving Europe in any sort of...
Why do you say... Oh, you mean...
why do we need them? And the quality of them.
I hear you. I don't think...
the cabinet.
I know. Crikey.
Seriously.
You're preaching to the choir here, mate. Chris Grayling, just to name but one. But I don't know... What I don't know is whether or not we've always... or for a couple of decades now, we've had really ropey... or at least for 10 years, we've had really ropey politicians at the top of government, but we didn't really realise because nothing that important was happening, and then boom, global crisis, austerity, and then Brexit. So
I agree with one thing you said. They do play to the galleries, I know. But, I mean, even the Prime Minister now, I'm no lover of the Prime Minister,
sure.
I know a lot of people think. But when you look at her statements that she's made, how can someone stand up and say Brexit means Brexit, no deal is better than a bad deal, and then she does this? And she's not being held to account for it by...
Well, I mean, you highlight a superb point. That's a brilliant point, because what, of course, she has to do today is turn a full circle on what she's been doing since becoming Prime Minister, and she has to try to convince everybody that a bad deal is better than no deal.
Seriously, Theresa May says it's raining. You look out the window to check. I mean, come on. Stand up and make the Mansion House speech, and then...
Because she had to keep... Because, again, this is why I'm more minded to criticise journalists than politicians, apart from the ones who were obviously pant-wettingly stupid. But Theresa May's job was actually to keep the dogs of Fleet Street from her door. So those phrases like Brexit means Brexit, we will deliver it, the will of the people, they weren't really designed for the electorate. They weren't designed for the likes of you and me. They were designed for Rupert Murdoch and Paul Dacre, who, for mostly commercial reasons, could have built some massive bonfires if it looked like she was going to deviate from that course, or possibly even duck the challenge. Chris, you've taken up the whole of the first quarter of the program, or the second quarter. I took up the whole of the first quarter, and that's a compliment to the quality of your contribution. The whole show will be full of people who are informed, but we will make room as well for anyone who wants to add to my list of people that Brexiters are going to blame instead of Brexiters. You don't have to blame yourself. You blame, as Chris did, the people who you trusted to tell you what was going on. And also, he raises a brilliant point about the European Parliament and Westminster. I think two problems here. The first was allowing no deal to become part of the conversation. And you remember what they did. This is the European Research Group, the ERG, Rees-Mogg's lot. They were the ones who said, well, we've got to threaten them with no deal. You must remember this. A kiss is still a kiss. You must remember this. They were the ones that said, well, don't be ridiculous. You've got to make them think that we'll walk away with no deal. And we would say to them, that's stupid. That is like holding a gun to your own head and saying to your interlocutor that if you don't do what we want, we will blow our own brains out. So as soon as no deal became part of the conversation, what has happened overnight became even more likely. And add to that freedom of movement red line, which meant there was no earthly way we were going to be able to be out of a club on better terms than the people still in it. And that, for me, unravels the whole short term of Brexit. Freedom of movement plus no deal rhetoric. The minute we started allowing the absolute charlatans in this debate to claim that no deal was a meaningful negotiation device, that's when one of the two remaining wheels on the bus came off. A lot of 50 keen to disassociate themselves from Chris and point out that they were not somehow generationally predispositioned to look at the European Union askance. He didn't suggest for a moment that everybody was. He was simply describing his own background. And for me, the key thing today is the gaslighting that's gone on. Look, I'm going to close my eyes genuinely. The camera's on. Right, I'm going to genuinely close my eyes. I'm going to read you chunks of this at some point in the programme, but for now, I'm just going to close my eyes, circle my pen around 2 sheets of paper, stick one in, and then read out whatever headline emerges. And this is all part of understanding how an entire country was persuaded that an organisation they were an intrinsic and valuable part of was somehow their enemy. OK, ready? Ooh. OK. Double-decker buses to be banned. That was a story in the Daily Telegraph that was laid at the feet of the EU. That's just the first one. It's not even in the top 10 for making you laugh and splutter in equal measure. Gary is in Chigwell. Gary, are you happy?
Yes, I'm very happy because at last we're on the road to staying in the European Union.
Oh.
And establishing our parliamentary democracy. Because Parliament is going to vote against this deal. The Prime Minister will resign, we'll have a second referendum, and we'll stay in the European Union.
Who do you think will offer a second referendum in their manifesto?
The new Conservative Prime Minister. There won't be a general election. But I want to say, you've been duped for the last 2 years.
Probably, Gary. Go on.
Right. because you keep going on about the referendum and the democracy, but it's not democratic. We live in a parliamentary democracy.
You cheeky beggar. I've pointed this out a million times. That white paper that said our parliament has always been sovereign. I'll tell you who you should be aiming your ire at, because the beauty of what's happened is, of course, the fact that the European Research Group are entirely responsible for their own misery today, because they encouraged the removal of transparency and parliamentary democracy. Remember that Enemies of the People headline about the judges and all of that? That the ERG actively agitated to move power from Parliament to the executive, and now look what they've got.
You're right. And also it allowed charlatans who can never get elected to Parliament to stick their,
Well, you say that, Gary. I think you mean they couldn't get elected to the British Parliament. I think
the British Parliament.
Yes, they can,
right.
and they could get elected to the European Parliament. Would you mind if I just referred you to events in the European Parliament yesterday, which I think are rather pertinent to our conversation today?
Right.
Here is a rather winning Dutch MEP speaking, needless to say, in fluent English.
Regards our colleague in seat number 20, colleague Farage, I would say to our guest, don't take his grandstanding too seriously. This is a man who actually led his country, led his party to a Brexit vote, only the next day to admit that he lied and tricked and to jump ship and leave his party. This is not leadership, it's a circus. Secondly, I'm glad you're here, Mr. Farage. Secondly, he says he doesn't want to be part of a German European Union, yet he has made sure that 2 of his children have German passports. This man wouldn't know hypocrisy if it stared him straight in the face.
We could do with some Dutch politicians, possibly, to improve the gene pool of our own parliament, Gary.
Yeah, very good. But also remember, we almost broke up the union with a referendum on Scotland.
Well, yeah, that's true.
Again,
by not
democracy.
Yeah, but if you were a tabloid newspaper editor, mate, that you're never going to make that sing. You're never going to make dull, functional, least bad descriptions sing. The only way you're going to flog newspapers to people is by pretending that there's some wonderful, what's it called, Camelot on the horizon, or that we're all going to have our unicorns by tea time. Mirages is what you have to sell. So you have to tell people that this is better, this grass is greener. Just, of course, now we're eating the grass. Gary, take care. I apologise for being duped. Jake is in Glossop. I used to live in Glossop, believe it or not. What would you like to say, Jake?
Hello there, James. How are you doing?
Very well indeed. What's on your mind?
If you don't mind, I'd like to start with 3 very short points.
Okay.
Firstly, I think you should perhaps reconsider using racial slurs like gammon.
It's not. It's a ham. It's a ham dish, Jake, describing stubbornness of opinion. The biggest gammon we've had on the programme in recent years was a Ugandan Asian currently living in Cheshire. But carry on.
Well, I've never heard someone that's not white be
you just
labelled
did.
as gammon.
You have, Jake.
Well, okay. Well, thank you for educating me.
You literally just did.
Right. Well, my second point is...
is it better than the first?
Sorry?
Is it as good as the first?
The second point, unlike an earlier caller, I voted to leave, but I do adore Europe. I love Europe. I have a European family. I visit Europe regularly. And I am 100% a European.
It's not really a point, Jake. It's more of a sort of chapter from your unpublished autobiography. But carry on.
It is a point because Remainers like to say that they're the ones that love Europe and everyone else...
No, you're joking, aren't you? All the gammon accounts on Twitter say, love Europe, hate the EU.
Well, that's a valid point, but you see Remainers sitting there with "I'm still European" T-shirts, as though everyone who voted to leave somehow doesn't consider themselves European.
Okay, so you do consider yourself European. Well done.
Yes,
and the third point?
Well, I just think it's an important point to make.
Well, I'm glad you have. Third point?
Well, thirdly, I don't care about Farage. I don't care about any of the rubbish that was talked about banning, buses, London buses, or anything like that. I agree with you that there was an awful lot of rubbish on both sides of the argument, but I think that one thing that we do need to remember is that most of the people that voted to leave voted based on a very simple principle, and that principle was sovereignty. That principle was the idea of nationhood.
No. Well, they might have done, but of course they were voting under the illusion that our parliament wasn't already sovereign.
Well, you say that, but then, we just had in the news yesterday that Merkel's proposing, or, she's talking again about the coming forth of an EU army.
Yes, which becomes more likely after our departure, because we would always, in the current political climate, have exercised our veto.
Okay, well...
So Brexit makes a European army more likely, the only difference being we won't be in it. Well done.
Well, that's not a good argument at all, because...
It's not an argument, mate. It's a statement of fact.
Well, you're using it as an argument, but...
I'm not. I'm just helping you out. It becomes more likely when we're not there, and we won't be in it. So if it is a bad thing, you've made it more likely, and if you're frightened of an army that you're actually in, you're kind of flying in the face of 2,000 years of military history. No, that's not fair. 3,000 years of military history.
So are you saying that we would be in the army even if we weren't in the EU?
No, I'm saying that if we were in the EU, our current political climate would probably compel us to exercise our power of veto at its creation, for reasons I don't fully understand, because I don't know why anyone would be frightened of being in an army as opposed to being an enemy of an army. But if we're not in the EU, we can't be in an EU army. Jake, with respect, mate, there is something called Google.
That's all well and good.
And do you know what you should Google first?
Right there now.
Do you know what you should Google first?
Go on.
Gammon. Stuart's in Northumberland. Stuart, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello, Stuart. Are you happy?
How are you? No. We're not. I'm not. I'm very indifferent today.
Go on.
I was probably say a reluctant Leave voter.
Yes.
I was never 100% either way.
Sounds
I'm a Tory
healthy.
voter.
Yes.
I'm a Tory member. I think the government has massively let everyone down in the negotiation process.
What do you think? What do you think they could have done differently?
I agree with you. To be fair, there's not much me and you agree on normally, but I agree with they should have delayed the Article 50.
But they wouldn't. I don't think her premiership would have survived if she'd done that.
To be fair, she probably shouldn't have been there in the first place.
Well, you're a Conservative Party member. I mean, there wasn't actually an election in the final analysis.
Because obviously Miss Ledson just wanted her job in cabinet, so she stepped aside.
Even if, and I'm not going to go all sort of answer the question on you, because today is a day for calm contemplation for most people. Even if they delayed Article 50, how do you think it could have gone better? Because for me, the minute the freedom of movement became the pivot in the whole referendum, then essentially we were trying to persuade ourselves that we would be able to leave a club and end up with better terms than the members of that club. And I don't know how that, even if we delayed Article 50 for 100 years, how could that ever have happened?
I was always a great believer in the Swiss model, which obviously has the freedom of movement still intact. I think the freedom of movement was sold as a big thing when the majority of people who probably didn't want the freedom of movement kind of wanted people who weren't EU nationals not in the country, and they couldn't see past the EU nationals coming over.
Well, once you've weaponised immigration, the distinction between a European expat moving here or someone from Southeast Asia becomes blurred, culminating in that infamous call to this programme, which saw someone reveal that he'd voted to leave the European Union because there were too many brown faces behind the tills in his local Tesco. That's the phenomenon you're describing.
Yeah, I mean, because there's so many brown people who are native to Europe.
I did point that out to the fella, and the penny did sort of drop halfway down.
I'm a great believer that if you contribute to society, it doesn't matter where you come from.
So can I ask why you voted to leave then, Stuart?
Yeah, basically, I'm one of these people who I don't mind a little bit of anarchy from time to time. And I think it can sometimes shake things up.
You voted for a little bit of chaos in the hope that we'd rebuild better than we burnt down.
Yeah, and it hasn't worked out.
Calf.
Yeah, and to be fair though, for the first year of it, the chaos was amazing. I actually really, really enjoyed the anarchy of it. Now, people say, how can you be an anarchist and a Tory? I totally get that.
Right.
I'm a Tory in the northeast of England. That's
pretty anarchic anyway. We're going a bit nuts now. I mean, together, collectively nuts. I don't want to insult you, but the chaos of that first year essentially involved the pound going off a cliff and the economic forecasts shrinking daily.
Well, the pound situation, the pound's always been overvalued anyway, in my opinion.
Okay.
And that was sort of a rejigging of where the natural order of the pound should be.
Okay. No one said that in the referendum campaign, of course. Everyone said they categorically stated that we'd be absolutely fine. I think Andrea Leadsom said the pound wouldn't budge a single penny.
Again, that's my opinion.
Yeah, but she's on your team.
Fluctuate. And like yesterday, the deal was...
mate, I'm sorry, I've just glanced at the clock and you've got one of those voices I could listen to you all day. I need to push you to the punchline, Stuart. Where are we today? How are you feeling today about the chaos and the anarchy and the vote to leave?
I think, personally, we should stop everything now and start again. I'd probably hate to use this, the second referendum, possibly.
And how would you vote in it?
Depends what...
I said I wasn't going to go full. I said I wasn't going to go full Paxman on you, but you don't get to put in any variables. How would you vote in it right now if it was today?
If it was today, I would remain. I'm a great believer in answering a question.
But you did. No, so am I, and I'm cracking on because I'm late. I'm late for the break, but that was very, very honest of you. I particularly enjoyed the way that it took such effort to actually squeeze the words out. But we got there in the end. One phone line free if you're quick. Ostensibly looking for people who are happy with what has happened overnight, what we believe the terms of this so-called deal will be. But so far only really finding people who are happy because they think it might be a precursor to a total collapse of Brexit. I think you might be counting your chickens. And the overarching question that we're going to try to answer in the course of the next hour of the programme is how did an entire country get groomed into believing that an organisation of which we were members was somehow simultaneously our enemy? And I've got some fairly compelling evidence for the defence on that one. First, though, LBC's political editor, Theo Usherwood, is like a dog with two tails this morning, wagging his way around Westminster. What's the latest, Theo?
The latest, let's start with a man called Geoffrey Cox, the Attorney General, known for his booming voice and his introductory speech for Theresa May at October's Conservative Party conference. His advice today to the Cabinet is going to be absolutely critical, and it all hinges on the backstop. Can Britain get out of the backstop if it so chooses? And from what we're hearing in Westminster this morning, he has concerns. He's been dubbed the Conservative Mufasa for his legal knowledge, prowess and ability to interpret the law. But if Geoffrey Cox doesn't like it, then Theresa May has a really big problem.
This needs a bit of explanation, for me at least. I apologise if everyone listening already understands, because it's contingent upon what happens at the border. So we could get out of the backstop if they can find some way of having regulatory alignment on both sides of the British border in Ireland that allows the sides that are in alignment to not be aligned. That's the crux of it, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
Right, and it always has been.
And that's why the Brexiteers are getting very wound up about the leaked note from Sabine Weyand, who is, of course, the opposite number to Oliver Robbins, the chief civil servant on our side, where she has put in writing that, in effect, the temporary customs arrangement is the basis for the future arrangement.
Yes.
So we're going to be tied to what Theresa May is proposing and what has been agreed
until they can tell us what this technological solution that actually works but doesn't currently exist is. And I think everybody knows, whether they're pretending not to or not, that it doesn't exist. So that's why the Brexiters are getting spooked, because having spent a year telling us it's really easy to do, they're now being told, well, show us.
Which has been repeatedly rejected by the European Union.
And if you can't show us what will work, then we'll have to keep regulatory alignment, which means the whole of the United Kingdom stays within, is she going to call it a customs union? Do you know, if she called it a customs union, Jack?
The temporary customs arrangement.
Temporary customs
arrangement. Which then becomes a permanent customs arrangement.
De facto.
De facto, because we can't get out of it.
Never formally. We can't get out of it because the solution to the Good Friday Agreement and regulatory alignment will never exist.
And because Geoffrey Cox is
a very good lawyer,
is saying that we won't be able to get out of it, that's a problem for Theresa May. Because how's she going to square that circle?
But does it get put to Parliament regardless of what happens in Cabinet?
No.
Oh.
So Cabinet need to approve it.
And not approving it would involve resigning. That becomes a genuine issue of collective cabinet responsibility.
And then it becomes about the individual players within the cabinet. So if you're talking about Andrea Leadsom, the Commons leader, or Penny Mordaunt, who Downing Street take a slightly dismissive view of, then they think the feeling is that they can deal with those. They can deal with pushback from those resignations. But what happens is if Michael Gove were to resign, or Brexit Secretary Dominic Raab were to resign...
And what are you hearing?
They're not going to resign, no.
Oh, really?
They've been squared. They're signed up to it at the moment. It's going to be a discussion. Downing Street really, really nervous about this. I bumped into a senior civil servant walking across Whitehall as I was sort of loitering, part of my job, and had a quick chat. And they're absolutely at pains to stress, James, that this is a conversation with the cabinet. It's a conversation that's going to be 3 hours long, and it is not simply a fait accompli, right, this is what's going to happen, because they know if they go down that route, they're only going to antagonise their critics, of which there are many.
But they can't tweak the document without going back to Sabine Wayand and
yeah, absolutely. It's a sell. No, you're quite right to point that out. There's no oh, we'll take this suggestion or we'll take that suggestion. It's a sell, but it's a discussion about the sell.
So if she gets it through cabinet, are you still of a view that the numbers in Parliament might work in her favour?
I'm changing that view. Am I allowed to change my view?
Of course you are. No. Well, Theresa May is. Brexiters are. So I don't see why you shouldn't.
So when I spoke to pro-European, moderate Labour MPs, which number around 30 to 40 a couple of weeks ago, they were of the view that they needed to do what was in the best interests of the country, and if the other option is a no-deal Brexit, then it is in the best interest of the country to vote for the deal. And the calculation the government is making is that actually those pro-European MPs who really don't like Jeremy Corbyn, whisper it quietly, would outnumber the Brexiteers and Remain Tory MPs, hardline Remain Tory MPs.
A stark choice between chopping off one leg or chopping off both, and not being given the option to keep two.
And the other option, making it you could throw in a confidence vote in there. Theresa May can make it a confidence vote. I go. General election. Jeremy Corbyn becomes Prime Minister. All of that, you could really ramp it up from Downing Street's point of view if they would choose to do so. But actually now, and I was speaking to Chukwuemeka, the MP for Streatham, earlier, there's a feeling, a consensus in Westminster, that stark choice between Theresa May's deal and a no deal just doesn't exist anymore. Theresa May just couldn't get a no deal through. She would be forced out by Remain ministers, cabinet ministers. They'd just simply go to her and say, no, this is untenable, we can't do this. And so then they're pushing the idea of actually they don't need to support it because that isn't the choice facing the country. Jeremy Corbyn becoming Prime Minister, general election, that isn't the choice. So it then becomes about the idea of a second referendum. And that's why Theresa May is in terms of parliamentary arithmetic, James, she's in real trouble.
And if it gets defeated, a second referendum becomes likely?
It could become likely. Big problem, though, with the question. So there are a number of options as to the question of that you put on the ballot paper for a second referendum. And obviously those pushing for a second referendum would like to see remaining within the European Union with our full rights and everything.
The three-way vote on this deal, no deal, or status quo.
And then, of course, the Leavers will throw their arms up in the air and say, well, you can't split our vote by saying Theresa May's deal or a no-deal Brexit, because that would be unfair.
And then we go exactly back to June 2016.
So then we have
they would end up arguing, no, we need to keep it really complicated, and we need to be able to make promises that actually cancel each other out, even though we're ostensibly on the same side.
Exactly.
Theo Osherwood, always a pleasure. We may return. I think is PMQs happening today, mate?
PMQs. Listen out for. I'm going to try and get you the best bits, James.
What do you do most weeks? Okay, nothing. Carry on. It's all good. It's 11 o'clock. You're listening to James O'Brien on, and Theo Osherwood. A bit more Theo time. Have we done a jingle yet, lads? Oh, come on. What a Theo time jingle, like Chico time, but with Theo. Very good morning to you. When did the penny start dropping for you about the sheer scale of the con and the catastrophe? For me, it was David Davis's tweets, because I didn't really know much about negotiating with the European Union. You'll be very surprised to hear. And I presumed he did. And then those tweets about what would happen in the event of a leave vote, and his absolute failure to understand, A, that you can't negotiate independently, with European Union member states on trade issues. B, that he'd be going to Germany, not Brussels, the day after the vote. C, I think he was one of the people who said the German car industry won't let it happen. I mean, abject ignorance and failure to understand. And when she put him in charge of leaving the European Union, despite the fact that he knew nothing, that's when I began to think, this is a naked emperor. This emperor is actually naked, not just sort of, some people are going to be a little bit disappointed, but an actually stark naked emperor. And here is David Davis this morning. This is the moment of truth. This is the fork in the road. Do we pursue a future as an independent nation or accept EU domination, imprisonment in the customs union and second-class status? Cabinet and all Conservative MPs should stand up, be counted and say no to this capitulation, says David Davis, about a withdrawal agreement that is based on the December 2017 joint report, which was negotiated by David Davis. That's the level of ignorance you're looking at. This man today will come out and say that the withdrawal agreement based on the joint report from last December that he presumably signed, he definitely negotiated, but I'm beginning to wonder whether he ever read it. I mean that. That's not a joke. He was overseeing negotiations. I would put money on the possibility that he signed it, oversaw the negotiations, but never read it. And if he read it, he clearly didn't understand it. He also unwittingly, in this tweet, of course, concedes that membership of the European Union affords us first-class status, when he writes, accept EU domination, imprisonment in the customs union and second-class status. Well, are you suggesting that what we currently have is first-class status, Mr. Davis? Because you probably should have said so sooner. But the crucial point here, of course, the penny drop moment, is his abject failure to either admit or to understand that the withdrawal agreement he is now complaining about is the child of the joint report which he negotiated. So these are the moments where you think, crikey, it is much worse than I thought. And again, on the macro question, this notion of us somehow not having independence or not having control, which is the fundamental lie at the heart of the whole Brexit project. Here's an amazing tweet from someone who describes himself as a Turkish foreign policy expert on Twitter, a chap called Bill Park. I love this. A UK that had lost its independence in the EU managed to stay outside the Eurozone and Schengen, introduce a gig economy, invade Iraq, hold referendums, devolve its political system, build 2 aircraft carriers, fight the Taliban, drive on the left and retain the monarchy. That's what we were doing while we weren't independent and we didn't have any control over our own politics. We stayed out of the Eurozone, we stayed out of Schengen, we introduced a gig economy, we invaded Iraq, we held referendums, we devolved our own political system within the United Kingdom, we built 2 aircraft carriers, we fought the Taliban in Afghanistan, we drive on the left and we retained the monarchy. God, those handcuffs, that straitjacket. Cool. Chafes a bit, eh, lads? 7 minutes after 11 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Nick's in Manchester. Nick, are you happy?
Not very happy.
Why not, Nick?
Well, obviously, James, I'm from, if you can't tell from the accent, I'm Northern Irish.
I may have detected a hint. I may have detected a hint of an accent.
I'm a long-time listener of the show, big fan.
Welcome. Thank you.
This is first-time caller. Definitely feel a bit nervous doing this.
I would cautiously suggest that this is the least bad. If it remains off the table, this looks like the least bad option for Northern Ireland.
Well, this is why I'm ringing.
Yeah.
Obviously, we've had overnight these agreements that have been put in place. Now we're heading into Brexit. No one knows what's going to happen. And we don't have any control over it. I'm an Irish Catholic. I live in Manchester. I have no disagreements with anybody, be they Protestant or English or whatever. But I feel very much that the DUP are trying to dominate the country. And I feel that they are pushing the country into a position where it's going backwards.
I understand that, but I think that's more feeling than fact-based, isn't it? Because they're not happy with this draft deal, from what we know. Jeffrey Donaldson has said that it fundamentally undermines the constitutional and economic integrity of the UK. I mean, if he's unhappy, arguably you should be happy.
I would say constitutionally that the people of Northern Ireland have the right to decide what they are going to do with the country. And Jeffrey Donaldson does not speak for all of the people.
He doesn't recognise, in a sense, the notion of a people of Northern Ireland as opposed to just more British people.
I mean, I watched Stephen Nolan on the, he's a broadcaster.
No, I know Stephen.
BBC.
I know him well.
He's a fantastic broadcaster.
All right, mate. He's also the opposition. Let's not give him too much credit, eh?
Sorry, Jim, sorry. But he does set up a good argument.
Yes.
And, he is... on one side, he's saying the Irish argument, on the other side, you have the British argument, and ultimately, we're left in no man's land. That's where Northern Ireland is.
Also, it's become clear that many people on the Brexit side of the debate would happily throw the Northern Irish people under a bus, regardless of which constituency.
That's how I feel. And I live in Manchester. I work in Manchester. I have been here for 7 years, and I love the British people, but I feel like Northern Ireland has been thrown under a bus.
And there's no a sucker in the thought that this, the details of the deal that we think are accurate, if it was upsetting the DUP, it wouldn't make you happy because we're too far down the road of unhappiness to find a reverse gear. Nick, thank you, mate. It's 10 minutes after 11. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Who haven't we spoken to? I mean, I guess the person who would rather remain, I think this is who Theresa May is relying on, the person who would rather remain but somehow accepts the inevitability of leaving and wants leaving to be to avoid as much unnecessary damage as possible. That to me is a position I nearly ended up in. The idea that we have to leave, they have to see what a disaster it is before they'll admit it was a terrible mistake. But I think we're getting enough evidence and information about how silly no deal would be. I'd rather have never seen no deal even talked about because it was such a stupid thing to do on every single level. Yet again, the ERG, the architects of their own disappointment today. But the idea that, well, if no deal is a plausible possibility, then I'm relieved that Theresa May has at least retained one of our legs, our metaphorical legs, as opposed to going down the legless route espoused by the likes of Johnson and Rees-Mogg. I don't know. If you're in that camp, I'd love to talk to you. A couple of phone lines free to that end. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. It's 2 phone lines free, actually, so be quick and you should get through. Brian is in Armagh, in Northern Ireland, appropriate enough. Brian, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello.
Thank you very much for having me on your show.
Very welcome.
It's a couple of things, but they're intertwined like a lot of things in this debate. The first one really is, maybe for listeners who aren't familiar with Northern Ireland and the intricacies of that, of the province. The first one is the Good Friday Agreement, and the whole idea is, well, a large part of the Good Friday Agreement was that it was sold both to Unionists and Nationalists in the following way. It was sold to Unionists in such a way that you could have your border, and that meant you were separate from the Republic of Ireland, but you were also part of the United Kingdom. So Unionists were happy-ish with that. It allowed Nationalists, those who... It was
a philosophical border more than a geographical one. I mean, albeit that it was geographical, nothing really happened there.
Exactly, correct. And, I've grown up and around, living on the border, and it allowed Nationalists to look at the border and kind of discount it because borders didn't really matter in the EU. So this idea, I've listened to a lot of Brexiteers and Tories coming on and saying that the border is only about the movement of goods and services, but they're wrong. It's not just about that. It's about, as you say, the philosophical idea.
Yes, of course.
And that was what the Good Friday Agreement was built upon. Now, the next part, I'll not take too long. I appreciate there's an awful lot of people looking to get on, James.
Cheers. But you're very interesting. I'll listen. I mean, you're very interesting, Brian. That's very polite of you, but I'm happy to listen for a bit. Don't feel under any pressure.
Okay, thank you. Is anyone happy? Well, I know quite a few people who are happy, James.
Who?
Well, first of all, I voted Remain. I would be from a Unionist background, and I like the idea of being part of the United Kingdom,
right?
But I also like the idea of being part of the EU.
Yeah.
So you could have your cake and eat it, basically.
Yeah.
There was nothing wrong. It didn't need fixed. Now, is anyone happy? I have friends who are very happy, and they're nationalists.
So they think a united Ireland is getting closer.
Yeah, exactly.
And that makes you unhappy as a unionist.
It does, only in that we have created a problem that didn't need created.
Yeah.
Whenever the referendum took place, and we're now, in the throes of Brexit, my friends who want a united Ireland see it as being the catalyst that 30 years of conflict in Northern Ireland could not achieve.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can see why, because this phrase in the GFA, the very simple phrase regulatory alignment, this is it's an unpickable lock, isn't it? You cannot have two separate economies or two separate regulatory frameworks and have regulatory alignment. I mean, so either the border moves to the Irish Sea, in which case Ireland is united in all but politics, or they call the whole thing off. I feel for you. I'm obviously not with a name like O'Brien. I'm historically going to lean a little bit more towards the nationalist take on Ireland than the unionist take. But I feel for you, mate, because I think in many ways you're the first people under the wheels of that ludicrous bus.
Absolutely. And the thing is, James, while I'm from a unionist background, I've a lot of friends that are nationalist, and it suited everybody. And
well, the point is that that's possibly not a phrase you would have uttered 30 years ago. I have a lot of friends who are nationalists, so it's a mark of how successful the Good Friday Agreement has been and how irresponsible and dangerous these snake oil salesmen who are kind of playing fast and loose with it are being. And they don't care about Northern Ireland. They don't care about unionists or nationalists.
Absolutely. And before I go on that point, going back to my friends who have always been very upfront, they were actually rubbing their hands with glee whenever the referendum result came in. And one of them actually said to me the next day, it's time for a border poll. Yeah. But with regards to those that you talk about within the kind of the hard right or the Brexiteers or whatever, it's very frustrating, and I can't say disappointing, because in Northern Ireland we always kind of knew that there was a section, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way. I lived in Manchester, like your previous caller.
Sure.
There's a section in England who don't really care about Northern Ireland. They probably don't. Again, this is just a supposition. They probably don't really care about Scotland or Wales.
No, I think. And do you know what, mate? I'll tell you something else that will happen soon, and this might need to be sort of put through the mangle of reason after I've said it out loud. But once it's Scotland and Wales, what happens then? I think Birmingham and London. I've already seen stuff like, I hate London, down with London. So once you've unleashed this tiger of whatever you want to call it, nationalism or xenophobia or othering, scaremongering, you start off by saying, I don't care about the I don't care about... I've had anti-Irish racism for the first time, I think, in my career since the Brexit vote, and it only has to reach for something else next, so you'll end up with people town versus city, north versus south, east versus west. I don't know where it ends, Brian.
No, but the thing is, the people who are selling this idea thrive on division. And that's my belief, because I've lived in division for 40-odd years.
And that's why we should have listened to you lot sooner.
Yeah.
Brian, look after yourself.
Thank you, James, for your time. I appreciate it.
No, I appreciate it too. Well, more, actually, because without you, I would only have half a show. 21 minutes after 11 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. You're a little bit distracted, going off in slightly different directions, but such is the nature of a conversation about potential chaos. For me, what's happened overnight has infuriated all of the people who kept insisting on two things. Number one, that that there was magic on the horizon, and number two, that it would be easy to achieve. The eggs out of a baked cake analogy that someone sent into the programme, and I've been passing off as my own ever since, has never sounded truer, has it, than it does today. It will be like once Maastricht was signed, then getting out would be like getting the eggs out of a baked cake. And that, that was the plan. The more interdependent we are, the less likely we are to go to war against each other. That was the fundamental foundation stone of the whole flipping project. And it's worked quite well. We haven't gone to war against each other since 1945. And then you look at some of the rhetoric of the people encouraging us to pull out of this union, And they are quite bellicose people. They are the kind of people who do talk about picking up rifles and wars and the French haven't forgiven the Americans. It's such a stop. The French haven't forgiven the Americans for helping to defeat the Germans. Imagine the kind of Play-Doh you'd need for a brain to come up with a conclusion like that. Didn't the French essentially bankroll the American War of Independence? That's something that historians can check out. But anyway, once you're in a kind of bowl of bigotry, once you're in a rabbit hole of deceit and self-deceit, you'll say anything to keep the ball in the air, you know? You'll say anything to keep the dream alive, which is how you end up saying such unbelievably stupid things. Like David Davis today, attacking the withdrawal agreement that's based upon the very thing that he negotiated back in December 2017. And a lot of them have queued up subsequently to say, of course, oh, well, I didn't really understand. It was a con. So the beauty of Brexit is that it never stops giving. If, like me, you're addicted to the analysis of it from a fact and evidence-based perspective, because what you have here, and I think Johnson did this as well, didn't he say that he didn't fully understand what was in the December 2017 document when he agreed to it? He didn't actually resign until Chequers. So what they're saying is, oh, well, we did something in December 2017 based on a misunderstanding. Please may we have the right to reverse our decision, please? Yeah, of course you can, lads. Can we have another referendum? No! Of course you can. Well, hang on. So you're... What? You're allowed to change your mind and claim that you didn't really understand what it was you were signing up for, but the country isn't? OK, yeah, crack on. 24 minutes after 11 is the time. Lee is in Cirencester. Lee, where are you today? Not geographically, but politically.
Yeah, well, you asked the question, who's happy?
Yes.
I wouldn't maybe go as far as saying I'm happy, but I'm as happy as I have been with Brexit over the last 2 years. One reason I woke up this morning knowing that hearing people like yourself and watching Twitter would be a bit of fun.
Sure.
Although... Listening to your last two callers, that sort of puts that in perspective. It does, it's quite a childish view.
Well, no, I mean, crikey, we're all human, aren't we? And we look for light relief where we can find it, and the smell of burning gammon is always very appetising. But yeah, if you were Northern Irish, you'd struggle to see the funny side at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. But being a Remainer, this has been very glass half full now. Hearing what the rumoured deal is likely to be, it's not as catastrophic as it could have been, and it's certainly going to be better than a no deal.
Yes.
Which... I've had 2 years of my head in my hands. You kind of cling to what you can. You look at this and think, well, we might come out of this and not, end up in a completely horrific position over the next...
There's all these phrases,
decade.
aren't there, that have come to mean so many different things to different people. If we could all have agreed on exactly what these words meant, we could have avoided some of the worst excesses of Brexit. And this notion of customs union, which almost all business have established as something that we need to retain in order to retain our commercial capabilities at the moment. And when she said we will definitely be leaving it, and now she's going to try and essentially stay in it by calling it something else, I don't know. I'm not going to write a book about Theresa May, mate, because I just don't know whether or not this was the plan all along.
Well, I mean, I've got a theory that I've had for 2 years now, where I wholly support a people's vote.
Yes,
and I was at the march a few weeks ago. If you were Theresa May and your ultimate plan all along was to have a people's vote, this is exactly how you'd have played it. The last 2 years is exactly how you'd have played it.
The problem with that is that people on the other side of the debate are going to start screaming in agreement with you and saying, but they will argue that she's deliberately sabotaged it, whereas we would argue that she's slowly opened the curtains on reality. And if she'd opened them too quickly, she'd have been chased out of town. If she'd left them closed, we could have ended up with no deal. So she's opened them very gently over a 2-year period until now we're all looking out the same window. None of us like what we see. The question of what we do next becomes urgent. But if I was a hardcore Brexiter, I would take your analysis and say, ha-ha, you see, she did it on purpose. She sabotaged the whole thing.
Yeah, well, she's led the Mail and the Express along as long as she can, keeping them happy until the absolute last minute. But it's an impossible situation.
Well, it is an impossible situation.
She has an impossible job. I'm not a fan of hers whatsoever. But I don't know what else she could have done.
No, well, this is what we did earlier in the week, actually, that odd thing that pops up on the programme every now and then where I have to concede and confess to feeling a degree of sympathy for her, but, of course, a very, very moderated sympathy. Here it is. This is why. Are you still there, Lee? Because I think you'll like this. Niall sent this in a while ago, but your point, I think you're on the same page. It goes, indulge Brexiteer fantasy for a moment. Is it possible that this has been May's plan all along? You play the arch Brexiteer all the way as part of an ultimate strategy to expose Brexit as the fantasy it is and force a choice between no deal and remain.
Yeah.
And do you know what Niall says at the end? Is she the Severus Snape of Brexit?
Yeah, but the problem with that is it relies on people on the leaving side to engage a bit of logic and admit that they're wrong and override cognitive dissonance, which we know is
that's not holding our breath.
Impossible.
Do you know what the other problem with that is? You haven't read Harry Potter, have you?
No, I haven't.
It's 28 minutes after 11. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, Severus Snape. I can't really explain that without doing a massive spoiler on people like Lee who are yet to discover the delights of Harry Potter. It's coming up to 11:30. I'm just going to do another pin the tail on the donkey, if you're just joining us. I've got 2 pages of A4 headlines over the last 20 years about the EU, published in British newspapers. And if you take them in their entirety together, it explains why what we just heard described as massive cognitive dissonance and denial of reality has occurred. And this is about an entire country being gaslit by its media into seeing something that we were an intrinsic and valued part of as somehow simultaneously being our enemy. So I'm going to go into town on these headlines in the course of the programme, but I'm just going to do one more. So I actually close my eyes, and I'm on film now, so you have to believe me. And then I just drop the pen somewhere on the page, and we find here, 2-for-1 bargains to be scrapped by EU. And that was in the Daily Mirror, a traditionally left-leaning newspaper, and somehow Brexit, despite Jeremy Corbyn's best efforts, continues to be portrayed as something that left-wing people like and right-wing people don't. That's another lie, folks. That's another part of the gaslighting that's been undertaken. It's going to break down eventually into sensible and informed people don't like it. Insensible and ill-informed people still do. Where we continue to contemplate is it the carcass of Brexit? Yeah, I suppose in many ways it's the carcass of hard Brexit, another one of those phrases that people used all the time without actually being able to tell us what it meant. This notion that we'd be free to sign trade deals with countries other than the European Union, which, when you looked at it closely, seemed to translate as we'll be able to sell the family jewels to Americans who will enrich a few Brits, particularly politicians, in return. But there are quite a few other areas that are worthy of a little further examination. For me, this is huge, the gaslighting of an entire population, because I listen to people I like and even perhaps respect professionally and try to understand how they've ended up in such a mess on this and talk about the European Union as if it is a negative entity, you know, this idea that people have been persuaded over decades that despite being incredibly important, valued members with a very firm hand on the tiller of the entire organisation, an organisation envisioned by the likes of Winston Churchill as the most effective imaginable bulwark against further European war, you know, negotiations undertaken by, whether you like her or not, Margaret Thatcher played a blinder in her negotiations with the European Union. We're not in Schengen. It wasn't her. I'm adding to the list of reasons why we could have easily, if we'd been bothered, and if selling tickets for the Speak Your Weight machine was anything like as easy as selling tickets for the ghost train, we could easily have painted EU membership in a much more positive light. And even take the bits of it that we probably will never be fully comfortable with and point out that we're not in them. We're not in the single currency. We're not in the Eurozone. We're not in the Schengen Agreement. All of these things. This is why when David Cameron went to somehow get more concessions from the European Union, I didn't really understand what he was playing at. What are you going to come back with, mate? Any Chamberlain illusions yet from the Conservative backbenchers, I wonder? Theresa May? I hold in my hand? I don't know. But that's the problem, isn't it? Is that we never really ever... I'm guilty of this as well. I was never guilty of doing the gaslighting, but I was certainly guilty of not turning on the real lights. I never really bothered portraying it as a positive. Why would you? You don't know what you've got till it's gone. Who'd have thought Joni Mitchell would turn out to be the best analyst of Brexit? Harry is in Cambridge. Harry, what's on your mind?
Oh, yeah. Well, resignation, I guess. In 2 ways. One, I'm expecting who's going to resign. I'm
going to have to sort that phone line out, Harry. If and this is very politely offered, if you change something between talking to the producers and talking to me, then it does elevate the risk of me not being able to hear you when you get through. So if you move from not hands-free to hands-free or hands-free, do you see what I mean? So Tim's in Rushlake Green. Tim, what do you think? Are you happy?
I'm broadly happy, yeah.
Go on.
I voted Remain.
Oh.
I've watched the Prime Minister try to negotiate a deal over many months and take endless criticism from all angles. And she's just kept her head down, and she's kept going, and with her supporters, with Ollie Robbins, these are very, very bright people, and they have got now the best deal that we are going to get from the European Union. And I suspect this will now be put to Parliament. And Parliament can either vote for it or they can't.
Yes.
Now, it's been quite interesting listening in the build-up to this, various politicians, Vince Cable in particular, saying, I will not vote for no deal. I'm not sure how that happens, mate. You can only vote for no deal. If you don't accept the deal that's presented, then we get no deal. I was listening to another speech-based radio station on Saturday morning.
Yes.
And it was a very interesting conversation, and political editor of the Financial Times suggested that he thought that this would probably get through.
Yes.
And the reason that he thought it would get through is that everybody talks about who's going to vote for, who's going to vote against. It's the abstentions. There are a lot of people in the Labour Party who are no fans of Theresa May, but I mean, Jeremy Corbyn's a good example. He probably, well, no, not probably, he is. He's a Leaver.
Yes, he is.
He's always been a Leaver,
yes,
absolutely been
clear.
a Leaver.
Absolutely.
He's not going to vote in her favour, but he will also take the argument that I can't vote against what people voted for in the referendum, therefore I am going to abstain. And I think the abstentions, there's not a prediction.
The abstentions might carry it.
But the abstentions will probably just get her there.
And
that will be the best deal that we can have in the circumstances.
In the circumstances being the crucial phrase, because you are, to employ one of my cruder analogies, you are essentially saying the prospect of ending up with no legs has become so real that I'm going to celebrate being left with one.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And if Parliament votes it down, I don't know what happens because we're running out of time. There isn't time to go and renegotiate something else.
Well, I know. I mean, that's the lie Johnson's putting out today, isn't it? That we could somehow all start all over again.
I don't think we can. We invoked Article 50, and there's all these arguments as to whether Article 50 is revocable or not, and I know Sir John Kerr, who wrote it, thinks it is.
He did, indeed.
I actually don't think it is. I am a lawyer.
Fair enough.
I have drafted stuff, especially something a couple of years ago, mine ended up in court, and they said, no, it doesn't mean what you think it does.
Yes. No, I mean that you're right. It's for the judges to decide, not for the draftsman. But do you? No. I mean, I don't think you will dispute that your position is partly defeatist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do. I actually don't agree with the calls for a second referendum. I do worry as to quite what state that would leave the country in,
especially if it was 50-50 again.
It will, God, it will, well, I mean, it will be close, whatever it is.
I don't know anymore, actually. I mean, you would, because I admire your philosophical approach to these matters and your sanguine nature. It speaks, actually, of a legalistic mind, doesn't it, rather than perhaps a journalistic one where I'm looking for a little bit more.
I just try not to get rattled by it. I absolutely was for Remain partly for the reasons that you give. It's the old cake thing. You know, how do you get the eggs out of a cooked cake? I just couldn't see a way that we could. I thought
that's the weirdest thing.
Then everyone will be asking for the. Yes. God knows how long. What the hell do we do now?
Yes, exactly.
No one had a clue where we then went. So, Remain was my vote. We lost it. You can go for all sorts of reasons why we lost it, but we lost it. And I think once we lost it, then we were locked into a path, I'm afraid.
I fully respect that position. I haven't reached it yet myself. I may do.
Right.
Because of that answer to the question of we lost it, why did we lose it? Well, because of epic cheating, weaponisation of some of the most vile and ancient of hatreds, the promotion and propulsion of some of the most vile and despicable human beings ever to disgrace public life in Britain. And I can persuade myself that somehow corrupts the result of the referendum. But I also completely completely see why you wouldn't see it that way. You would see it as a fait accompli that is not to be revisited. In which case, yeah, I mean, it's not quite cracking open the champagne, but it is perhaps mopping a brow with a sigh of relief. What a lovely call, thank you. Let's have Harry another go. Harry's in Cambridge. Couple of minutes, Harry. What would you like to say?
Can you hear me okay
it's
now?
even worse, mate. 11:42. Heads will roll. Oliver is in, or Olivier, which speaks perhaps of a Belgian or a French origin, is in Lewisham. Olivier, what would you like to say?
Hi there. Hello. Yes. Hi. I'm a long-time listener, big fan. Thanks for taking my call.
Well, thank you for calling.
Yes. So I have 2 points. First of all, and both of them I think are things which haven't really been spoken about much. First of all, I'm going to start with the Chequers plan, and from what we understand it, I would actually make the argument that as far as plans go, it is probably the closest to a 52-48 kind of plan.
That's a very good
that we can ever get to.
Yeah. I also don't really see how a workable, plausible plan could have looked much different from that. But it's of course then the tension between people claiming something that's implausible is plausible returns to the fore.
Oh, no, I completely agree, and I agree with a lot of the things that you say generally.
I hope there's a
Brexit.
big but coming, Olivier.
Oh, there is a but not towards you. The but is towards generally all the hoo-ha about this Chequers deal, which is, well, if the politicians are actually being true to politics, this deal is probably the best reflection of the vote that could go. It doesn't make anyone happy.
No, it doesn't.
And no one is happy from the result anyway, because no one got a swing either way. And the Chequers plan is not a swing in any direction.
No, but in a sense, nobody being happy is the perfect reflection of a 52-48 vote.
Exactly. So that's my first point.
Well, you need to make your second one very quickly.
Yes, my second point is that even though I might sound like I'm English, I'm not. I'm from Belgium, but born and bred in this country my whole life. And because of the EU, my parents, before I turned 18, never saw the point in me getting a British passport.
Of course.
Which means that I was not allowed to vote in the referendum. And that's the case for a lot of my friends who are from Europe but lived their whole life in this country.
Yes.
Whereas on the other hand, all my friends who are from the Commonwealth, who are equally sort of foreign nationals as I am, were allowed to vote. And I feel like there's something very sort of undemocratic about that process.
Quite discriminatory, I guess.
Yes, quite discriminatory about that process.
And of course, to even things out, to make things fair, it wouldn't be a case of taking it away from your friends who hail from Commonwealth countries. It would simply be a case of extending that franchise to you and your friends who hail from other European countries. Olivier, thank you very much. As promised, I'm just going to share with you some of the headlines that I genuinely think, I know I can be a little bit hyperbolic at times, but I genuinely think this unlocks everything. If you were an outsider, this is the position I always try to adopt. If you were an outsider looking in, if you'd been on Mars for 30 years or you'd been in a coma and you'd come back and you'd looked at what Britain has done to itself and you wanted to work out why, and then people you love, not just people you like, but people you love, people you know, people you respect, who talk to you as if the European Union is our enemy, and you want to work out how they've ended up being in that kind of position. Oh, they can't bully us. It's not them bullying us. It's us. All the way. And you want to work out how that happens. Here's your answer. 20 years worth of headlines put together by a blogger called Tom Pride. I shall start now. EC regulations to ban playgrounds, Daily Express. Rolling acres outlawed by Brussels, Daily Telegraph. EU to scrap British exams, Sunday Express. Obscure EU law halting the sale of English oak seeds, Mail on Sunday. EU may try to ban sweet and toy ads, The Times. EU to tell British farmers what they can grow, Daily Mail. EU bans boozing, Daily Star. Light ale to be forced to change its name by Eurocrats, Daily Mail. EU fanatics to be forced to sing dire anthem about EU motherland, The Sun. British apple trees facing chop by EU, The Times. EC plan to ban noisy toys. Cannot be called eggs, Daily Mail. Brussels to ban HGV drivers from wearing glasses, The Times. Domain names .uk to be replaced by .eu, Daily Mail. EU to ban bagpipes and trapeze artists, The Sun. Children to be banned from blowing up balloons under EU safety rules, Daily Telegraph. Straight cucumbers, The Sun. Curved bananas banned by Brussels bureaucrats, The Sun, the Daily Mail, the Daily Express. Brussels bans barmaids from showing cleavage, The Sun, the Daily Telegraph. Rumpold's wig to be scrapped by EU, The Mail on Sunday. Church bells silenced by fear of EU law, the Daily Telegraph. Motorists to be charged to drive in city centres under EU plans, the Daily Telegraph. EU to stop binge drinking by slapping extra tax on our booze, the Sun. Brandy butter to be renamed Brandy Spreadable Fat, the European. Shall I carry on? Or shall I do it at the next junction as well? I think we'll do a hard break at the end of the next junction. I'll just lead straight into it. And there's another page and a half of this, and they're just the headlines. Imagine the articles. And what's heartbreaking about this is how all those poor people ended up ringing my programme thinking that when they said, oh, I can't wait to escape those laws, it had never actually occurred to them that they wouldn't be able to name any. That's why, isn't it? Where did we get up to? I don't want to repeat myself. It was the brandy butter one was the last one, right? There you go. I just put a biro mark next to that. Very high-tech in this studio. There's 2 phone lines free on my board. We're talking about Brexit, wondering about what happens next, asking whether or not you're happy. 0345 6060 973. And I wonder whether, and we can keep this friendly, I think, I wonder whether you can recognise what I've just described. If you're listening to that long, long list, you don't notice when it's happening, because it doesn't happen like a sledgehammer. It's a drip, 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 and you're suddenly hearing me read out all those headlines, and you're going, oh my God, that's how it happened. They're not our enemies. They're not our foes. Why did I end up thinking the EU was something that we had to be in opposition to and escape from? That now you realise, as I read those headlines, after headline, after headline, after headline, you realise that's where it happened. I got groomed. By the Daily Mail, by the Daily Telegraph, by the Daily Express, by the Sun. I got groomed. I don't think you should beat yourself up for that, because so much effort was put into doing it and so little effort was put into preventing it. It's a miracle the result of the referendum wasn't 99-1. Lawrence is in Watford. Lawrence, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I think it's the first time I've called you on the line.
Well, I'd like to think you'd remember if it wasn't, Lawrence.
Yeah.
Carry on.
Yeah, I've got an IT background. I've run quite a number of large programs as well, worked for government, worked for various industries.
Okay.
And when the Brexit vote happened, I could see it was going to be a disaster, purely because, I've dealt with supply chains and other industries where you can see the just-in-time take place. But, over the last 2 years, it started to dawn on me that the way we set up as a country in terms of governance,
yes, we have
people that sit at the top pretty much in all walks of industry, whether it be running a project or a program. And I started off with a technical background, and as I progressed through my career, it's always said, the higher you go up, the less detail you need to understand, the less involvement you need to get into the detail of things. So
you're like a figurehead who's getting advised by the people who are doing the detail and the heavy lifting.
Correct.
Okay,
correct.
I buy that. That makes sense. Yeah. It's why we have civil servants, isn't it, essentially?
Exactly. So I think you get to a point where you get so far removed from the reality of things that you don't understand how things are run. Or potentially you get people who get promoted to those positions who don't start at the bottom, don't understand what the detail is. And therefore you get to a point where you get politicians that aren't really close to a coalface, understand the industries,
yes,
that can actually say things that don't make any sense to the person that's actually doing the job, but makes a brilliant sense to people that think, this could be done a lot easier, a lot better to our benefit.
Throw in a little bit of charisma and boundless self-confidence, and you've pretty much unpicked the whole sorry mess, haven't you? With a short list of men mostly, who we're all thinking of now, as you describe people with charisma and self-confidence who actually, it turns out, don't know what they're talking about.
Exactly. I always took the route of understanding the job, understanding the technicalities, reading up on it, taken the time and to actually understand what I'm actually doing as far as a project or a program is concerned.
Of course.
And it's led pretty much to all of my programs, all of my projects being successful.
Yes.
Because I could tell if someone's is spinning me a yarn about a particular piece of work they're doing, or a person that I need to hire isn't up to scratch. And I could, mitigate that by bringing more people in or bringing better people in or whatever.
So the alarm bell for you then, the biggest and the loudest alarm bell, would have been when they were queuing up to say things like it will be the easiest deal in human history.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, they talk about electronic systems and systems that could be implemented for the customs borders. I've worked in a number of complex systems, and there is no way you could get a system in place very quickly. The complexity of it all, the systems you would need would cost a fortune. We've seen what a mess the universal credit has been. We've seen what a mess the NHS systems trying to combine those have been. It would take us years. And the biggest problem we have is even with this deal, the reason why I'm unhappy about it, even with if it was to get through, we would see a decline in the economy. We would see a decline in the UK.
But not as bad as we would see if we didn't get any deal at all. And that's where the sense of relief for some Remainers comes from today.
Absolutely. But it would... I'll tell you why it would be as bad. It's because you would get the people that voted Brexit that wanted a complete divorce will say, well, they're just screwing us over, because we can't do what we wanted to do. We're now... our economy is taking a downturn. We're now worse off. So, you get them even more antagonised.
You're describing the worst of all possible worlds, in a sense.
And it would be from, you get it from the Remain side as well, because if you start to see...
We should have gone all the way. So she's tried to balance it and not leave anybody desolate, but to leave everyone dismayed. And of course, further down the line, that allows both sides to say, if you'd done it my way, things would have gone better.
Correct. And it will just cause even a bigger rift. So I marched on the People's Vote because I think, I'm always, as a project manager, program manager, I'm always there to look at the risks, look at the facts that come through on a weekly basis, on a daily basis, let alone weekly. But to change and change my opinion, change my views about the direction of travel, to make sure that we keep things on track in the right way that is benefiting for the company, the organisation I work for, to ensure that we get the best outcome.
Yeah, but what you've got to remember is that you are tendering for this contract against someone who is promising unicorns and jam for tea, aren't you?
Yeah.
And that's where Remain failed, because it can't. You cannot compete with people who are making undeliverable promises, and they're still making them. Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg, and the other shower of charlatans who are still potentially poised to lead this country into utterly unnecessary pain. But Lawrence, brilliant analysis. Great calls today. Let's break with tradition a little and cross live to the House of Commons for PMQs.
Time and time again, he has stood up in this House and complained and said that the government isn't making progress, the government isn't anywhere close to a deal. Now, when we're making progress and close to a deal, he's complaining about that. Can I just say, I think what that clearly shows is that he and the Labour Party have only one intention. That is to frustrate Brexit and betray the vote of the British people.
Jeremy Corbyn!
Well, Mr. Speaker, after the utter shambles of the last 2 years of negotiations, the Prime Minister should look to herself in this. And she hasn't managed to convince quite a lot of people behind her. The Minister resigned last week, saying to present the nation with a choice between two deeply unattractive outcomes, vassalage and chaos, is a failure of British statecraft on a scale unseen since the Suez Crisis. And that from a Tory MP. Last night, the EU's lead Brexit negotiator reportedly told the 27 European ambassadors the UK must align their rules, but the the EU will retain all the controls. Is that a fair summary of the Prime Minister's deal?
Prime Minister! Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, as I have said all along throughout these negotiations, what we are doing is negotiating a good deal for the United Kingdom. We're negotiating a deal that delivers on the vote of the British people, that takes back control of our money law and borders, that ensures we leave the common fisheries policy, we leave the customs union, we leave the common agricultural policy, but we protect jobs, we protect security, and we protect the integrity of the United Kingdom.
Jeremy Corbyn! Mr. Speaker, under the Prime Minister's deal, we're going to spend years with less say over our laws or how our money is spent. And the International Trade Secretary said last week that the decision to withdraw from any backstop agreement could not be contracted to somebody else. Can the Prime Minister confirm whether under her deal it will be the sovereign right of the UK Parliament to unilaterally withdraw from any backstop?
Prime Minister! I say to the right honourable gentleman, there needs to be a backstop as an insurance policy. There needs to be a backstop as an insurance policy, but neither side actually wants us to be in that backstop because we want to bring the future relationship into place at the end of December 2020. And I'm aware of the concerns that there are, that we don't want to be in a position where the European Union would find it comfortable to keep the United Kingdom in the backstop permanently. And that's why any backstop has to be temporary.
Jeremy Corbyn! Mr. Speaker, I think that non-answer has confirmed that Parliament won't have that sovereign right. Mr. Speaker, the International Trade Secretary breezily declared he'd have 40 trade deals ready to be signed the second after midnight when we leave the EU.
How's it going?
Well, with 4 months to go, can the Prime Minister tell us exactly how many of these 40 deals have been negotiated?
Prime Minister! We are doing two things. First of all, we are negotiating to ensure that we maintain the trade deals that currently exist with the European Union when we leave the...
Order. I'm sorry. It's not acceptable for members to shout at the Prime Minister when she's answering questions. We've been talking recently in this chamber about respect and good behaviour. On both sides, the person who has the floor must be heard. And that's the end of the matter. The Prime Minister.
We have been negotiating on two fronts. We're negotiating on the continuity agreements, which ensure that those trade deals that we've been party to as a member of the European Union are able to continue when we leave the European Union. And we have also started discussions with other countries about the trade deals that we can forge across the world once we leave the European Union. But I say to the right honourable gentleman, if he's interested in trade deals, he really needs to sort out the Labour Party's position on this issue. Because originally they said that they wanted to do trade deals around the rest of the world. Now he says he wants to be in the customs union. That would stop him from doing trade deals around the rest of the world. We know what's good for this country, an independent trade policy and trade deals, good trade deals with Europe and with the rest of the world.
Jeremy Corbyn! Mr. Speaker, the International Trade Secretary is not the only one who doesn't understand international trade rules. And he's not the only one in the Cabinet. And he's not the only one in the Cabinet that doesn't understand a few things. The Brexit Secretary said last week, and I quote, "I hadn't previously understood the extent of this, but we are particularly reliant on the Dover to Calais crossing." When did the Prime Minister become aware of this absolutely shocking revelation about Britain's trade routes?
The Prime Minister...
I really have to say to the right honourable gentleman, he stands here and reads out something that says that we don't know about trade policy. We do know about trade policy. That's exactly why we're negotiating the continuity agreements. It's why we'll be taking our place as an independent state in the World Trade Organization. But he wants to talk about different positions that are being taken. What we're doing is delivering a good deal that will deliver on the vote of the British people. We're delivering Brexit. What have we seen recently from the Labour Party? Well, the Labour leader said we can't stop Brexit. The shadow Brexit secretary said we can stop it. So when he stands stands up, he should make it clear. Is it Labour Party policy to stop Brexit?
Jeremy Corbyn! Mr. Speaker, Labour respects the result of the referendum. But what we don't respect is the shambolic mess that this government has made of negotiations. The mess they've created that they can't now get themselves out of. We won't let them destroy this country's economy or the jobs and life chances of so many others. And Mr. Speaker, if the Brexit Secretary is still in office by the time the Cabinet meets this afternoon, could she take him on one side and have a quiet word with him and tell him that 10,000 lorries arrive at Dover every day, handling 17% of this country's entire trade in goods, estimated to be £122 billion last year. This woeful ignorance by a person in high office is disturbing to so many people. This government, Mr. Speaker, has spent 2 years negotiating a bad deal that will leave the country in an indefinite halfway house without a real say. Yet they think they can impose a false choice on Parliament between a half-baked deal or no deal, when a sensible alternative plan could bring together...
No matter how long it takes, the right honourable gentleman will not be shouted down in the House of Commons. It's as simple and unarguable as that. Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, when a sensible alternative plan could bring together Parliament and the country, even Conservative MPs say the Prime Minister is offering a choice between the worst of all worlds and a catastrophic series of consequences. When will the Prime Minister recognise that neither of these options is acceptable?
The right honourable gentleman talks about woeful ignorance. I'll tell him where the woeful ignorance lies. It lies on a Labour Party front bench that thinks you can build a better economy by spending £1,000 billion more, putting up people's taxes and destroying jobs. The real threat to jobs and growth in this country sits on the Labour Party front bench. And I'll tell him what we're delivering in relation to Brexit. He says, what about Brexit? Yes, I'll tell him what we're delivering on Brexit. We will not rerun the referendum. We will not renege on the decision of the British people. We will leave the customs union, we will leave the common fisheries policy, we will leave the common agricultural policy, and we will take back control of our money, laws and borders. We will deliver Brexit, and the United Kingdom is leaving the European Union on the 29th of March 2019.
Mr. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the Prime Minister aware
It's 30 minutes after 12. You'll forgive me, I don't think I can bear listening to Peter Bone's voice, actually. If he says something interesting, we'll get Theo to cover it. Come here a minute, I've had a plan. Should we not tell Theo that we've already listened to it when he gets here at 12:45 to do his roundup of what's happened at PMQ? Should we all pretend that we don't know anything? Because he won't be listening to me now, he'll be listening to this. He won't know that we've taken it live. Or would that be really immature? Well, both, actually. It'd be great fun and really immature. Do you want some more headlines? Can we try and get the fade to work properly this time? I want to be faded out, like we do sometimes when people are sort of soiling themselves live on air. Can we get it right this time? Where were we? We were at Brandy Butter, weren't we? Okay. These are all stories, because this is an act of love for me, okay? This is how it happens. This is how people you love, people you respect, people you might be sitting next to now, have ended up thinking that the European Union was somehow our enemy, as opposed to just something that we are part of. This is how they did it. British loaf of bread under threat from EU, Daily Mail. Truckers face EU ban on fry-ups, The Sun. EU to ban Union flag from British meat packs, The Daily Express. EU seeks to outlaw 60 dog breeds, Europa News Agency. Double-decker buses to be banned, Daily Telegraph. EU bans eating competition cakes, The Times. Now EU officials want control of your candles, in capital letters, The Daily Express. 21-gun salutes are just too loud, Brussels tells the Royal Artillery, The Mail on Sunday. Brussels threatens charity shops and car boot sales, The Daily Mail. Plot to axe British number plates for standardised EU design. Daily Express. Details about sex lives in planned EU census, the Daily Express. British cheese faces extinction under EU rules, PA. EU meddlers ban kids on milk rounds, the Sun and the Daily Telegraph. British chocolate to be renamed Vegelut under EU rules, the Daily Mail. EU to ban church bells, the Daily Telegraph. British film producers warn of new EU threat to industry, the Independent. Kilts to be branded women's wear by EU, the Daily Record. EU to ban double-decker buses, the Daily Mail. Cod to be renamed Gadus, thanks to the EU, the Daily Mail. Do you know, I haven't even got close to the bottom of the first page. And all of these stories have been published without withdrawal or apology over the last 20 years in this country. And do you remember Flor, who rang in yesterday? The lovely young lady who apologised in advance that English wasn't her first language and then proceeded to speak English approximately 7 times better than any gammon who's ever rung the programme. She's just sent me a list of something that the European Commission itself puts together, addressing precisely these points. I've tweeted it from my account, if you follow me, on Twitter, at Mr. James OB. They have a Euro myths index, A to Z. So these are myths that have been perpetrated about the EU, and it goes back possibly even further than this list assembled by Tom Pride, the blogger. And the A's alone will fill up a whole screen on my computer, from abattoirs to aviation. All of them out there persuading us that we were somehow enemies of an institution we were simply important members of. 20 minutes after 12. That, for me, I mean, even I'm shocked by this, and I've been a journalist for 20 years. I've worked on the newspapers that are listed here. I've certainly read them all. And even I'm sitting here going, oh, my days. It's a crisis of journalism, this. It's a massive failure of journalism. And most of the people that wrote these stories, here's the real kicker, won't have meant them. They'd have just thought it was a bit of fun. You know, Boris Johnson wrote 2 columns in the middle of June of 2016. One explaining why he was supporting Remain, one explaining why he was supporting Leave. And then he sat there and thought, what's best for my career? And he told you all to vote Leave. He spent 30 years writing these stories. He invented this particular art form, this particular conjuring trick, this particular deception, this deceit. Saw himself grow fat on it, while we were being denied knowledge and understanding of really important issues, which is why we've ended up in such a mess. We'll catch up at PMQs in about 25 minutes. Corbyn was besting Theresa May there because, of course, he doesn't have to offer up an alternative. It's a great day to be leader of the opposition when the government are on a back foot, a horrible back foot. It should be under fire from our own backbenchers. I didn't need to hear Peter Bone's contribution to know what it would be. Oh, blah, 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 blah. You've let us all down. Blah, blah, blah. Treachery, treachery. Infamy, infamy. They've all got infamy. This concludes Peter Bone's contribution to the British political discourse over the last 30 years. And that's why, isn't it? It's these lists. Shall I go on? Where did we get up to? Cod to be renamed Gadus, thanks to the EU. Brussels to restrict drinking habits of Britain's coffee lovers, the Daily Express. EU responsible for your hay fever, the Daily Mail and the Times. Condom dimensions to be harmonised, the Independent on Sunday. EU wants to ban your photos of the London Eye, the Daily Express. Corgis to be banned by the EU, the Daily Mail. That's a humdinger of a story, because, of course, you'd doff your cap and tug your forelock at Her Majesty as well, while getting cross with Brussels for wanting to ban corgis. Eurocrats to ban crayons and colouring pencils, reported The Sun. EU forcing cows to wear nappies. That's in the Daily Mail. Smoky bacon crisps face EU ban, Sunday Times. EU outlaws teeth whitening products, the Daily Mail. It's insane. And bearing in mind, I'm a bit of an anorak on this. I'm one of the people that actually caused this deal to be so bad because I didn't believe in Brexit enough. You're familiar with this line of argument on social media. If only you lot had accepted it and got behind it. To which I believe the correct response is, you won. Get over it. James is in Glasgow. James, are you happy?
Absolutely not, James. But it's a pleasure to speak to you. You're probably the only sensible head in this in the media at the moment, James.
That's a bit of an exaggeration, but I shall take it to the bank in the meantime.
Sure, absolutely. But you're going along with that long list of things.
Oh, mate, I've hardly started.
by the media. Yeah, absolutely. You're only just started, but you got to kind of question yourself or question the media why they're promoting it so much, especially when all of these companies are owned by super rich billionaires with Tory party affiliations. And you got to question yourself after all of these, like finance detriments or science detriments and so on and so forth, Northern Irish border. Why is it still being pushed? And I really want that exposed on the radio, in the sense that why are these super rich or these backbencher Tories wanting a Brexit? Because in my head, I'm hearing about things in the European Union that they want to avoid tax havens, etc.
There is legislation on the horizon that would make tax avoidance and sundry other slightly unpleasant financial mechanisms illegal, and we would be able to opt out of that, but not under the terms of today's deal, oddly enough, which is perhaps why so many faces abuse with anger. But it's not just them, is it? Because it's this list of stories I've been reading out. That's decent people who've just been fed, even without knowing they were being fed it. Is it?
Sure. But that's the feeding themselves. Who's doing the actual feeding? And that's my question, and what everybody really should be thinking about. Who will gain out of Brexit? Why was the vote set up in the first place? Why did people want it all to happen? There's no question that it was all pushed through very illegally and pushed through all these mainstream medias. I mean, I think I laughed at one of the last ones that you were saying about no corgis in Britain or something like that, which is just absolutely ridiculous. But it's why is that happening? And I think everybody should be actually thinking about that point. Why do some people in these backbenches who should know about everything, I mean, these guys are the guys that are running the country, us down on the bottom level, it's understandable that we don't understand all the ins and outs of the European Union. That makes sense, and especially back in 2016, I felt confused in the first place.
Yes,
now,
but that's it.
People want it. Why do they want it?
It's the fraudulent certainty. People who don't actually understand anything, utterly convinced of their own rectitude, and that's part of the problem. Then you've got the slightly more conspiratorial theory that you put together. I don't think that press barons have been sitting there for 30 years saying we have to slowly, like a boiled frog, we have to gaslight the British public into voting to leave the European Union. I don't think it was that complex. I think they just saw the response that Johnson's lies got when he was filing them back from Brussels, and it was a simple commercial imperative to file some more nonsense about bananas, Boris. They've all gone mad for it. We sold more copies when we put it on the front page, and he's still there. He's still on the front page telling his lies. So it was simply a way of selling newspapers. Then you look at some of the people, the Barclay brothers in particular, who own the Daily Telegraph and also own the Ritz, but somehow bankroll people claiming to be anti-elite. I mean, you've got something very dodgy going on there, but I always lean towards the more simple explanation, the less conspiratorial one. There's some vested interest.
No, sure. I absolutely understand that, and it does absolutely sell newspapers when you're firing out with all these.
It's the ghost train, mate. And it wouldn't. If it wasn't the EU, it would be single mothers, and if it wasn't single mothers, it would be Muslims, and if it wasn't Muslims, it would be immigrants. If it wasn't immigrants, it would be Roma. It doesn't matter what it is.
Selling newspapers anymore because we've already went through their hate of brown people, but so we're pretty bored of that now. So we need new people to hate, which is of course
you got it.
Your Romanians or Polish people at the moment.
Don't forget the faceless bureaucrats in Brussels, James. They're the worst.
Oh, no.
Oh, and George Soros. I mean Jews, obviously. When people say George Soros, they mean Jews. But we'll pretend it's not anti-Semitism and conspiracy theory, and we'll say George Soros. He's. And then, of course, someone marches into a synagogue or sends pipe bombs to American journalists and politicians because they've been somehow persuaded that George Soros poses a very real threat to the Western world. And I don't know where on earth they get that idea from, but it's now actually leading to terrorism.
Sure.
Happy days, James.
No, thanks very much. But I think everybody should be thinking about that.
I think you're absolutely right. I think you're absolutely right.
Somebody getting extremely rich out of this.
Who's winning?
James, thanks very much for your
you mind how you go. Who is winning and what are they winning? And actually, who on earth could have persuaded potential terrorists that George Soros was their somehow sworn enemy?
Regards our colleague in seat number 20, colleague Farage. I would say to our guest, don't take his grandstanding too seriously. This is a man who actually led his country, led his party to a Brexit vote, only the next day to admit that he lied and tricked and to jump ship and leave his party. This is not leadership, it's a circus. Secondly, Secondly, I'm glad you're here, Mr. Farage. Secondly, he says he doesn't want to be part of a German European Union, yet he has made sure that 2 of his children have German passports. This man wouldn't know hypocrisy if it stared him straight in the face.
28 minutes after 12. Should we EU to ban selling eggs by the dozen, the Daily Mail. UK to be forced to adopt continental 2-pin plug, the Daily Star and the Daily Mail. EU targets traditional Sunday roast, Sun on Sunday. And I'll tell you what's fascinating about this list, truly fascinating. None of these stories involve immigration. So look at that collage of front pages that pops up frequently on your social media and recognise the race hate that was fostered and engendered by newspaper editors. And then think about what people who aren't racists or obsessed with immigration or aren't xenophobic. Because this was another one of the biggest lies the Leavers told. Every time you pointed out that every racist in the country voted to leave the European Union, the liars said that we were saying everyone who voted to leave the European Union was a racist. Now, that's not true. It doesn't matter how many times you say it. Some people, of course, have got so much gammon in their ears, they will never actually hear it. All they'll ever hear is little echoes of their own prejudices and bigotries. But everyone I know that voted to leave the European Union, I've got friends, colleagues, obviously, family members, everyone I know and like who voted to leave the European Union is not a racist, not even close to being a racist. So how did they end up thinking that this organisation was somehow their enemy? EU targets traditional Sunday roast, Sun on Sunday. English Channel to be renamed Anglo-French Pond, the Daily Mail. Brussels to force EU flag on England shirts, the Daily Mail. EU orders farmers to give toys to pigs, the Times. Firemen's poles outlawed by EU, the Daily Mail. Euro ban on food waste means swans cannot be fed, the Observer. Noise regulations to force football goers to wear earplugs, the Sun. That's how it happened. And I genuinely don't think it was a deliberate con. I think it just was selling tickets for the ghost train. And now we can't get off it. Or can we? Football goes to wear earplugs, the Sun. Traditional Irish funeral under threat from the EU, the Daily Telegraph and the Times. EU to ban high-heeled shoes for hairdressers, the Daily Express. Commission to force fishermen to wear hairnets, the Daily Telegraph. Brussels to ban herbal cures, the Daily Express. Bureaucrats declare Britain is not an island, the Guardian. EU bid to ban life sentences for murderers, the Daily Express. And I could go on. I wonder whether Dominic Raab read that one about Britain not being an island. Bureaucrats declare Britain is not an island, and that's why he ended up so confused about Britain's island status or his unique geographical something or other, as he described it. I think Corbyn's had a cracking PMQs, but, of course, he hasn't had a cracking campaign. Unless the plan all along is to stick the brakes on and put us into reverse. But I look at that man and I do not see someone who understands much, let alone the dangers of Brexit. I see someone who for 30 years has seen the European Union as being an obstacle to a sort of Marxist dream of collectivisation and massive programmes of nationalisation, and therefore an enemy of the EU. But I would, as ever, I hope this isn't going to be the new one. I say I hope I'm wrong. Corbyn ends up Prime Minister. I hope I'm wrong, that he's not a massive Brexiter. Everything's up for grabs now. Absolutely everything. We'll find out from Theo in about 10 minutes just how good or bad that exchange at PMQs was for the two main party leaders. Probably, I would have thought, as a mark of Brexit and how it's broken everything, probably more daggers being stared at Theresa May from behind her today than from in front of her. Probably. Ivor is in Crystal Palace. Ivor, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Really enjoy your show, and for just, you're a warm bath of reason on a wintry landscape, so keep up the good work, mate.
Can
really
we put that on a poster?
More than happy to. My rates are reasonable. I just want to sort of come at this from a sort of an international, global perspective, because you're talking about a lot of the myths that there are about the EU, and it drives me nuts too. But I would argue that there's also, a lot of myths about Britain's wider place in the world, and particularly our, imperial history, and also what the Commonwealth is and isn't. And I think There's sort of two reasons why I'm really interested in this. Firstly, my day job is working with UK companies and Whitehall departments in promoting UK PLC around the world and getting out there and helping to export UK companies. You know, post Brexit, that's obviously it's not impossible, but it's obviously it is a bit tougher these days, and there's lots of Schadenfreude about what's happening back at the ranch, as it were. But the other reason is I'm a hybrid. I'm a half Kiwi, half Brit, and my family are from up in Lancashire on the English side. But I was born in New Zealand, and I'm very much a 50-50, insider and outsider, as it were. And I think, looking at this as a New Zealander, I find it really, really interesting. This whole sort of the myth around this sort of recreation of Empire 2.0 and falling back on the Commonwealth, and it's absolute fantasy.
Yes.
It's just nuts to think that we can replace our integral and quite powerful relationship in the world's largest single market for goods and services with the sort of these Rees-Mogg, Johnson-esque, fantasies of the halcyon days of yore, and the fact that we've got the Indias and the Ugandas and the Zimbabwe's and the Australias and New Zealanders, running to make trade deals with Britain. And it's not to say that there isn't interest in some of these countries, but the idea that we're going to replace the amount of volume of trade... It's
unbelievable.
It's unbelievable. And
except really it's not unbelievable, because it's of a piece with all that's gone before, isn't it, in a sense?
Absolutely. And the story of New Zealand, I think, is actually quite instructive, because a lot of New Zealanders, I'm from a line of dairy farmers back in New Zealand, and a lot of my mum's generation are still pretty annoyed at Britain for joining the EEC back in 1973. There was a sense of betrayal, and they've sort of, cast their lot in with Europe, and they've cut off New Zealand, which at the time was exporting about 50% of its goods in meat and dairy and cheese to Britain exclusively. So it was a really, really difficult time for New Zealand. But what New Zealand had to do then was to repivot and think, right, who are we going to trade with in the world? And ironically, the success story of New Zealand over the last 2 to 3 decades has been the fact that it's integrated itself with its own neighbourhood. We accepted the fact that we had to start trading more and more with our neighbours.
I think this is called the trade theory of gravity, if I've understood it correctly.
Absolutely. And it was actually unusual to be Britain's offshore farm when Britain was literally on the other side of the planet. We needed to be trading with our neighbours in Australia.
It's so logical when you put it like that, apart from the Commonwealth or Empire hangover, which makes you think that the mothership back in Blighty is the one you should be sending all your lamb to, even though it is literally on the other side of the world and there's a customer around the corner.
Yeah, it's so far away that if you keep going, you start coming back. I mean, we're literally on the other side of the planet, and so it was difficult at the time, but in many ways it was only difficult for people that were sort of wedded to the theology of empire as opposed to the reality of where it makes sense to trade. And it's not to say that New Zealand doesn't have a very strong relationship with the UK now. We do, and it's a very close relationship. But it's the trading relationship is fundamentally different to what it used to be. And this, I think if I remember rightly, I think it's less than 1% of Britain's trade is with New Zealand, and it's only about it's roughly about 1% with Australia, which is an economy that's about 5 times the size.
It's not hard to see why when you just remember the geography. I've seen some Australian Trade Department analysis as well, which is, and I was just trying to find it. There's a chap on Twitter who goes by the name Steve Analyst, who's done some brilliant stuff in this field. I keep meaning to get him in the studio and I keep forgetting. But Australia, I mean, the document, I'm doing this from memory, so forgive me if I misspeak. But essentially a sort of reflecting exactly what you say about uncertainty and gravity, how far away it is, but also saying they could be so weakened by Brexit and so desperate to sign deals with us that we could end up actually pretty much laying down the terms and conditions of trade in a way that we would never get away with now.
Absolutely, and I think there's also a lot of anxiety in Australia and New Zealand about what moving over to the WTO rules means, because naturally Australia and New Zealand farmers are looking to protect their exports that are currently going into the EU, and it's really, really complicated, and I don't fully understand it, but the way that...
Do you know what you just did there? You just said a phrase that you will never, ever, ever hear Jacob Rees-Mogg or Boris Johnson or Liam Fox or David Davis saying. I just don't really understand it. And that's why we're in this mess.
Absolutely. And if more people could say that, if more people could just accept the fact that actually the problem with Brexit isn't the hooded bureaucrats in Brussels or the conspiracy theorists in wherever. It's Brexit. The problem with Brexit is Brexit. It's the complexity of this cul-de-sac that we've got ourselves into, and nobody wants to admit the fact that actually this is extraordinarily complex, and it breaks my heart, especially when it's based on a lot of myths and misinformation about what the wider world looks like.
Especially when the people who are going to get hit the hardest and hurt the most are the ones who've been most successfully persuaded that it would somehow be a good idea to do this. I'm having that phrase, though. You've just come up with the successor to Brexit means Brexit, haven't you?
Yeah, yeah.
The problem with Brexit is Brexit.
It is Brexit. It is Brexit, and nobody...
Love it.
You made a good point a few weeks ago, actually.
First time for everything, Ivor.
You did, actually. I wrote it down at the time, I think.
Good grief.
You were talking about how someone like Jacob Rees-Mogg, with this sort of dulcet tones and this calm way of speaking, he comes across as incredibly believable, and yet you find yourself halfway through a conversation or listening to him, and you're thinking, no, this doesn't actually make sense. But there's a part of my brain that wants to believe this guy because he does sound...
I think it's deference. I think it's the forelock-tugging mentality that we all Brits, even half-Brits, like you, possibly have deep down somewhere inside us. There is a sort of feudal sense that and he poses as the lord of the manor, and we presume that he's got our best interests at heart. But
it's the same with Boris Johnson. It's like, it's just because someone speaks Greek and Latin and their middle name is De Pfeffel, you sort of think, this guy must know what he's talking about,
I think this is you. You were educated in New Zealand, were you?
In New Zealand and London.
Yeah, okay. Because I think going to public school actually gave me the glasses to see through these clowns. I think that because and my school was not populated with charlatans and snake oil salesmen like that at all, but the notion that somehow an accident of birth imbues you with intellectual integrity is intrinsic to sustaining an aristocracy, but it's utterly anathema to anyone who relies on evidence and reason. You've brought me right up to the break. What a lovely call. I look forward to the next one, and I'm having that phrase. Hey, do you know what the problem with Brexit is? Brexit. Scotch whisky rebranded a dangerous chemical by the EU to ban rocking horses, British rhubarb to be straight, The Sun, the Daily Telegraph. EU tells women to hand in worn-out sex toys, The Sun. Queen to be forced to get her own tea by EU, The Sun. It's just not a mystery anymore, is it? Neither, when I asked you earlier where on earth people were getting the idea that George Soros was somehow a threat to their lives, obviously some of you very kindly have started answering the question. It was rhetorical.
I really feel that Soros, in many ways, is the biggest danger to the entire Western world.
Theo Usherwood is here. And Beth has spoiled my joke. She's told me that you were aware that we've already listened to PMQ, so I was going to pretend that we didn't.
But then I'd come down with all of this Jeremy Corbyn audio and try to do it fresh.
So we heard that. Some people might be tuning in just for Theo time. Frankly, it's unlikely, but you never know. So do remember.
Summation.
Yes, exactly.
Good outing from Jeremy Corbyn, wasn't it?
I thought so. Yes.
Clear winner today at PMQ's, finishing off with this flourish.
Come on.
Mr. Speaker, when a sensible alternative plan could bring together Parliament and the country, even Conservative MPs say the Prime Minister is offering a choice between the worst of all worlds and a catastrophic series of consequences. When will the Prime Minister recognise that neither of these options is acceptable?
The bit that he's referring to in the beginning of that, of course, is Labour is promising to keep Britain effectively and Northern Ireland in a customs union.
Which means that we retain freedom of movement.
Yes.
Yes.
But he wants
the official Labour Party position?
Well, no, because
so this alternative plan that could unite the country and Parliament.
But I think what they're doing it in Labour are doing it in stages, because they know that they have to try and that's why you end up with this intentional confusion, because they need to try and keep Labour voters in traditional constituencies that went to UKIP, and if they suddenly say, well, we can't sort, under our plans we can't sort freedom of movement, then that model goes bust.
Yes. Well, I think we're making the same point.
Yeah. Preemptive strike, and he was the same one making the same point that we've been hearing from Remain supporting MPs this morning. The government simply can't foister a deal on Britain and then force it through Parliament, because the only other alternative is no-deal Brexit. So Mr Corbyn, of course, wants a general election so he can become Prime Minister. Many of his own MPs aren't so keen. They'd prefer a second referendum. And this was the key line, wasn't it, from Theresa May? That isn't going to happen under her.
We will not rerun the referendum. We will not renege on the decision of the British people. We will leave the customs union, we will leave the common fisheries policy, we will leave the common agricultural policy, and we will take back control of our money, laws and borders. We will deliver Brexit, and the United Kingdom is leaving the European Union on the 29th of March 2019.
Boris Johnson was at PMQs. He wasn't sitting down. He was leaning against a pillar in the Commons, shaking his head. If Mrs May was hoping for an easier ride after Mr Corbyn's questions, she wasn't going to get it, James. Up stepped Peter Bone. This is probably the most brutal question of a Prime Minister. I know you don't like Peter Bone, but this is probably the most brutal question asked by a supporter of the Prime Minister I have ever heard.
Go on.
Is the Prime Minister aware that if the media reports about the EU agreement are in any way accurate, you are not delivering the Brexit people voted for, and today you will lose the support of many Conservative MPs and millions of voters across the country?
Prime Minister! Really? Wasn't that brutal?
Your own MP telling you you're going to lose...
This is through the lens of Brexit, mate. Everything's gone bonkers. Peter Bone, of course, famously used to mention his wife, didn't he, in Parliament? A great upholder of family values until he left her. Carry on.
The PM could barely respond to that question.
No.
Can I say to my honourable friend that what we have been negotiating is a deal that does deliver on the vote of the British people. In the list that I set out earlier, I left out one of the things that the British people are very keen to see from this deal, which is an end to free movement, and we will ensure that we are delivering on that, as well as those other elements that I have set out. What we're doing is a deal that delivers on that vote, but in doing so protects jobs, protects the integrity of our United Kingdom, and protects the security of people in this country.
It was then Ken Clarke's turn. Talk, James, this lunchtime of a white paper outlining the withdrawal agreement being published alongside that 500-page
You need
document.
that. I mean, that's like a translation, isn't it, from very turgid legalese into slightly more manageable language.
It's the first formal stage of any legislative process. If you want to bring a legislation forward, you need a white paper, and it usually accompanies some form of ministerial statement. It should usually be an oral statement to the House of Commons. The PM or relevant minister would outline exactly what was being proposed. Of course, there are no plans for such a ministerial statement at the moment. Mrs May could speak to the media after the Cabinet today. The thrust of Mr Clarke's argument, that just simply wasn't good enough.
Will the Prime Minister give an assurance that if and when this deal is published, a statement will be made to this House of Commons when it is produced? Because it is this Parliament which is going to have to decide now what to do next, and you don't want Parliament only to be consulted after another 24 hours of rumours and criticism. We must re-establish parliamentary sovereignty, and I wish the Prime Minister well in obtaining a majority for some course of action in future which is in the national interest.
If you didn't hear the sort of inflection in the last part of his question, it was clear he's not going to support the Prime Minister's deal. He thinks it's
off, isn't it?
It's off.
Yeah, don't you think now? It's not. I mean, they're all united. I saw, was it Lewis Goodall over at Sky News? Yeah, he said he was trying to make a list of ones he thought weren't going to vote for it, and he'd only got as far as B, and he already had 5 or something like that. I mean, you don't need many.
Well, the majority would be 10, but of course the DUP aren't supporting it at the moment.
Because we don't know what Labour's going to do, although that was a good performance by Corbyn, which might have brought a few back into the fold.
But Labour is going to oppose the deal.
So we're looking at the rebels who might have just been brought
back. Yeah, but they're not going to. But they're not going. As we were discussing earlier, James, they're not going to. They fear, and from those I've spoken to, they had the possibility of supporting the government because they didn't want a general election. But now, because the prospect of a no-deal Brexit seems to be off the table, that this choice that Theresa May is presenting doesn't seem to be workable. This hard choice doesn't seem to be workable. It then becomes about a second referendum, or then we enter new territory because there's no point in them supporting government because they don't have to fear a Corbyn administration.
Thank God all the other things that government could be concentrating on, like housing and knife crime and homelessness, thank God they're all going so well.
Yeah. Well, that's it. I mean, I don't know what...
We've got 90 seconds left. Should we sit here and stroke our chins? Should we be like the old fellas in the Muppet Show?
Well, look, I have actually got... Look, there's something else to say. Go on. There's something else to say. Look, we may not even get that far, because if the Cabinet back the deal this afternoon, support the Prime Minister this afternoon, and then she's in a position where she can sign it off, the pressure then mounts on the chairman of the 1922 committee, Graham Brady. The talk is more letters go in. We have a leadership challenge towards the end of the week, possible no confidence vote on Monday. With the emergency summit in the European Union on Sunday.
Coming up on Sunday.
Sunday the 25th.
Yeah.
That's the next big hurdle.
Speaking of Sunday the 25th, if you're kind enough to be in touch, I'm moaning about the absence of tickets for my Leveson lecture on Monday the 26th, and indeed for my appearance at the Hay Literary Festival on the previous Saturday the 24th. There are, I think, still a few tickets left. I thought I was going to have to plug this mercilessly, because they've even tried to flog meet and greets with me. Even my mum... Sorry, no, we'll have a lovely time. But there are a few tickets left still for an event I'm doing for the Make Some Noise charity here at LBC in January, in conversation with me. And actually, the person I'm in conversation with is a proper treat, actually, so I'm not allowed to tell you who it is yet. But it's no one who works here, just in case you're worried or indeed excited about that prospect. But if you go over to lbc.co.uk, you can find out how to get some tickets there. And yes, I will be signing books. Shall I pass on to Sheila Fogarty now before my head explodes?
I just want to know who the person is now, male or female?
Female.
Acting or singing?
Neither.
Books?
No, TV.
TV?
Journalist. Let me say, she's quite used to dealing with an overbearing, slightly pleased with himself man every morning. It is, but let's leave it there. Let's leave it there.
Oh, it's Michelle Hussein, isn't it?
Moving in the right direction.
Okay.
But you haven't quite got there yet.
Let's leave it. Let's leave it. Thank you very much indeed. I'll talk to you later, Theo.